So, hey guys, my name is Jacob Surber. I am the product manager for a new tool called Edge Reflow. I say it's new, but we introduced it we announced it about a year ago. We first released it back in February. Since February, we've had about 6 updates to the tool, and it's been a really fascinating ride for me. In purely the aspect of building a brand new product and starting to bring it out to market, getting feedback, and talking to people about the challenges that they had. I actually would like to know a little bit about you guys. So, who considers themselves a designer? It's okay. There's hands slowly creeping up. It's we still like designers. So how many people would you consider yourself a developer? That's a lot of people. But then I think the kind of important piece is I think more so today than I've seen in a long time, there's much more of a gradient between the two. It's not just that you're a designer or you're a developer, but you fall somewhere in the middle. And it can kind of be awkward sometimes in conversations. But I guess the last question would be, who would actually put yourself somewhere in the middle between a designer and a developer? Perfect, because I think largely that's been a lot of the motivation behind Reflow, is to help this group of people that are falling in between and where traditional tools may not help, and you want to be able to express visually a little bit more than just coding can. We're seeing a new cropping up of tools. So if you're not familiar with Reflow, it is a brand new tool that's targeting responsive design. Now, I think the actual title on the talk was Responsive Design with Reflow. But to me, responsive design is not necessarily a thing so much anymore, and it's just a piece of web design. So I renamed the track to Web Design with Reflow, because you should be able to design any new site using the philosophies behind responsive and the approaches. Now, a full-blown responsive site may not be the right thing to do every time, but there are certainly aspects of responsive that find their way into every project. So if we take web design and we start to break that down, there's obviously 2 distinct chunks to this. So we have web, but then there's so many other kinds of design. And I think what we're finding today is that you need to have a certain specialization in web design. You could be a fantastic print designer. You could be an amazing visual designer. But those skills, that knowledge, that experience may not actually translate to the web. Then I think there's the other half, that there's designers in particular. And I think a bit later on I'll pick on web or designers. I think they're amazing, and they're just so fundamentally different from, I think, the way they solve problems or approach problems than a developer, that the process couldn't continue without them. But it also makes some challenges in building a tool. So if we think about the process of web design, to me, there's basically 2 ways you can take this. You can take what I call the top-down approach. So this is really much more visual. So if you were to be working in something like Photoshop, maybe Illustrator, these are 2 fantastic tools for looking at the problem holistically, creating some very beautiful pictures. I mean, these are incredibly powerful tools. But they are abstracted away from the thing that we're targeting. And I think I'll probably bring this up about 8 times over the course of the talk. But I think there's always the idea of the right tool for the right job. And so where you can create such fantastic fidelity when you give this design to a developer, there's so many things inside of it that aren't going to translate. From a design standpoint, you're really passing the ball over to the developer and saying, you interpret all of these huge gaps that these tools are leaving. I'm not going to determine that from a design standpoint. you're going to determine it at the point of implementation. And I think at the end of the day, so many gaps get glossed over, skipped, implemented differently than maybe the designer thought. And there's always, it's two trains on the same track. And there's inevitably going to be a collision. Then there's the bottom-up approach. And so to me, this is much more maybe the code-first approach, the design in the browser. Maybe you think about your page structure, your semantics, and you start to build up from there. You look at CSS and you start to make some gradients. I've known some extremely talented designers who start designing in the browser first. And more power to them. I think the number of designers who can do that and do that very well is not very large, and I think those designers that can do it in the browser are fantastically successful, but it's not the overwhelming majority. And I think from a design standpoint, there's a big challenge with designing in the browser. And when working in a tool like Photoshop, there's things like silly putty or penicillin. These were happy accidents that happened during the process of creation. You did not set out to create silly putty. I mean, I'd love to wake up in the morning and be like, damn it, today I want to invent silly putty. But it's as you're creating something, you come up and you're like, wow, this has an application that I never even thought of. And I think that's really one of the advantages of working in a tool like Photoshop or Illustrator, where the only limitation is just your imagination. And when you're designing in the browser first, you are immediately presented with the limitations of HTML, of the browser that you're working in, and then also how well you can keep that mental picture of what you're trying to tackle. So then there is kind of this third approach, and the content first route I think is kind of interesting. It takes the aspects of the designing in the browser and designing in a tool like Photoshop or Illustrator, but you're starting with something that's your content, and I think that's a bar that there are elements in your page that you have to deal with. There's importance to those things. And so, to me, this isn't top down, bottom up. It's really a way of moving through. And I think there's really no tools that support you in doing this. So in many ways, it probably is more of a browser-based approach. Either that or you're copying and pasting your content into Photoshop. Like it gets very confusing. But when you take a content-first approach, you are going to be successful and responsive. You are going to be thinking about the hierarchy of your information, what's going to be important on different screen sizes. So it's very good to think about trying to do this, but I will caveat that it's not simple to do. All of that being said, I think as designers, as web developers, as people that are targeting content for multiple screens, there's a huge level of change coming. Now, I'm not actually sure what that change is. It's little zombies, come on. Zombies could be coming. Nothing. Okay. Team dynamics and individual responsibilities. Far less terrifying than zombies. Maybe. Like, this actually scares a lot of people. And I think especially the designers on a team. Because traditionally, designers have been able to work inside of the tools that odds are they've spent their entire lives in. They went to school to learn how to use this specific tool. But that tool and that workflow is no longer enough. And so the team dynamics is the designer needs to be pulled deeper into the process, needs to be working with the web developer. And individual responsibilities in that no longer can a designer ignore what's going to happen when you throw that design over the wall. I think the days of delivering a design that you don't know that it is implementable on the web, you just can't do that anymore. You have to have a fundamental understanding of HTML, CSS, and web layout to really be a truly successful web designer. Now, to get there, there's a lot of things that can help. I think this is where tools come in. Now, from a responsive standpoint, one of the tools that I found a little while ago is a way to start to inspect some projects that are out there. You'll notice it's actually a Chrome extension. It's that red guy up there in the upper right. So this is the responsive inspector. Now, I've seen a lot of templates out there, a lot of grid systems, a lot of things, I don't know, template PSDs, things you can open up inside of Photoshop or Illustrator that show a few predefined sizes, screen sizes. So you may have an iPad, you may have an iPhone, and you may have a desktop. And for those of you that are curious, that is not responsive design. If you'd like to argue that after this discussion, I will be happy to. Because responsive design is about creating visuals and content that it can appear on any screen size. And the responsive inspector is that highlighted that to me more so than just about anything else. So what this little guy does, when you click on it, it pops open a little dialog. Now this is the relatively recent redesign to Gizmodo to be responsive. And this shows you every single media query on this page. Now, I think it's only showing 8 or so, but you can also see the scroll bar. I think there's 16 or 17 different media queries on this site. And inside of the inspector, you can actually click on any of those lines. It'll resize the browser, and you can start to see the little variations that happen. And to me, that's the essence of responsive design. It's not, I guess, what I'd call responsive development, necessarily how you would structure the media queries or what libraries you would use. But from a design standpoint, how can you start to think about what aspects of that site need to change at each individual size and keep all of that into your head? And this is only 13. So there's Vogue UK. If you haven't looked at this page, there's not a chance in the world it's going to load on the Wi-Fi here. But check it out. I stopped counting after 32 media queries. It's incredible. Now, I'm not saying every responsive design needs to have 32 media queries, but what you start to see here is truly that design aspect of responsive content. As you start to slowly resize the browser, you start to see small things change. The fonts will bump up a couple of points. Text will align over to the left. You know, it's a lot of subtlety. And the entire idea behind that is you have no idea where this is going to be loaded up on. What are the dimensions where it's going to be shown? What's the DPI it's going to be consumed at? You know, the old example of there's going to be a screen in your refrigerator. What resolution is going to be at that? Why am I looking at Vogue on my refrigerator? I mean, there's lots of challenges that are going to arise with this. But again, it's the design aspect. I think if you are targeting iPhone, iPad, and desktop, you know, that's just a way to maybe be able to put a stamp on a project to say it's responsive, but that's in no way accounting for any screen, any way that people are going to be consuming this content. So in the process of creating tools and creating these different design approaches, there's a level of abstraction. So if we look at abstraction, you know, here we have some bytecode. If anybody can tell me what this means, I will buy your conference pass. Because this means virtually nothing to anybody. But when we add a layer of abstraction, you get something like this, and this is actually valuable. This is what we can do. This is what we can interact with. And so they say abstraction is good here. But so we start to look at our HTML and our JavaScript, and we start to talk about layers of abstraction. Like, this is often the look that you get. It's also probably why you're talking about HTML development with some guy who probably works on a ranch. I don't know, he looks angry. But so many people will jump to the conclusion that abstraction is bad. But I guess why is that? And to me, again, and I'm going to say this a lot, it's the right tool for the right job. Now, I think far too often people take tools that are meant for something and try and squeeze it in for something else. I mean, I'll talk about Photoshop in that respect, in that the lengths and the workarounds and the plugins, the things that I've seen people do inside of Photoshop is incredible. I mean, they've taken a tool that was created 20 years ago to create things that, I mean, didn't even exist when the tool was conceived. And so if you could look and find the right tool for the right job, what does that start to mean? So, kind of getting ahead of myself, you know, in the design process, we have these tools. And so where you can create, I think Illustrator's done a tremendous job adapting to web design over the last couple of years. You can save out to SVG. There was a recent update to Illustrator that vastly improved the SVG output to Illustrator. I mean, out of curiosity, how many people are using SVG these days in a project? Yeah, it's shockingly low. I mean, anybody, why not use SVG more in your projects? So yeah, support not being there in the browser. That's the common thing that I've heard. I mean, what browsers are you targeting that, I mean, i7? Like, are we looking backward compatibility? Yeah, yeah, again, early versions of Android.
Yeah, well, Android 2, 3, 2, 4 is, you know,
yep.
so recently vastly exceeded Android 4.
So. Yeah.
Firefox rendering.
Yeah, distorted in Firefox. Yeah.
And that's how close to relatively recent versions of Fire. I mean, really?
Yeah,
those guys.
And
They got to be in here somewhere.
How many users of your product use
yeah.
Firefox?
Because SVG is a fantastic tool for responsive design. I mean, it's scalable. It's in the name. You know, we especially with Retina. You know, you have no idea where, again, this content is going to be consumed. It's lightweight. You can even make it dynamic. It's programmable. Like, SVG is fantastic. And so I think, again, the more we push on these things as a development community, we highlight these problems, they can get fixed. They will get fixed. But we have to make a fuss. You know, Photoshop, again, they just released some new tools that we'll talk about in a little bit around asset extraction. But still, Photoshop is fantastic at making static graphics. Static graphics don't scale. You need to create multiple versions of those graphics to look good on your site. Things working with fixed and absolute positions. You know, if you are targeting the web, there's going to be some inherent challenges. So one of the core philosophies when we started to build Reflow is the concept of honesty in design. We have a design surface, and anything that you create on this design surface will render in the browser. I mean, to that end, we built Reflow in HTML and JavaScript. Everything except that very top file bar is actually written in HTML and JavaScript. All the interactions, the design surface is Chromium based. You know, everything, the entire intent here is to not give you tools that are going to hurt yourself, but give you tools where you can express your creativity. And also design for the medium. So I think there is naturally going to be hindrances in designing in an environment like Reflow over designing in an environment like Photoshop. I think that's fine. And again, right tool for the right job. But when you start to design for the platform that you're targeting, you're going to be able to have a conversation much deeper into the process of the implementation, the creation, because you're working in the same medium, you're targeting the same terminology, you can have much more meaningful conversations. I think the other thing that working on a web-based canvas gets you is fantastically captured in a blog post by a guy by the name of Trent Walton. So he wrote a blog post called Content Choreography. If you guys have not read this, I mean, it's short, it's very to the point. Please read it, because to me it really embodies why designers need to think deeper about the designs they deliver. So it's not about static visuals anymore. It's about how these visuals adapt and how the content is literally choreographed across these different devices, these different screen sizes. So this is obviously not a simple problem it's not a problem that, I mean, I think it's been, over the last year or two, it's been gaining a lot of traction. So there's really several emerging tools. If we look at even just over the course of this year, we started out earlier in the year with some tools like DivShot and Easel. So both of these were browser-based tools that I think were targeting things like working with Bootstrap, taking some predefined components, allowing you to lay them out on the screen, customize them, and I think it was really a very interesting, good start to designing for the web. Reflow, we came out in February, and I think we're really trying to solve that design challenge. A couple of recent additions being Webflow and Frunt, really some awesome guys on those teams. They're local here, and I think I mean, again, just personal opinion, I think they're solving the problem much more from a web layout standpoint. You can get, I think, a lot further into the process, but it lacks a certain level of that creativity and possibly some of that happy accident that might happen. Typecast, I think, is actually really interesting, but it's very much focused on type. If you want to change your line height, see how type is going to render on a page. They were actually acquired over the course of this year by Monotype, I believe, and it's very type-centric. And so I think it's, again, just solving a sliver of the problem. And then here off on the right, there's Macaw. It's a new tool that's not yet out. They've shown a couple of videos. It looks very interesting, and I think they're ultimately looking to solve the problem in similar to the same way that we are. I think they're releasing sometime next year, and it'll be fascinating to see what they do. But the big thing that I think all of these guys have in common is they're new. They're trying to solve a problem that's new and in new ways. And so inherently, there's going to be gaps, bumps in the road, things where I think there's going to be disappointment. And the key to advancing any of these tools is around sticking with it, actually learning about it, and providing feedback. A great quote I heard from Reid Hoffman was about if you are not embarrassed by the first version of your product, you've launched too late. And to me, this really resonated. When we launched Reflow back in February, it was extremely interesting, but not very good. I think it said, here's a problem area where we need to start to figure things out. But we need to quickly iterate. We need to get feedback. We need to change how we do things. And I think to that extent, we've been releasing every 4 to 6 weeks since February. And at least inside of Adobe, that level of agility, that frequency of updates has literally never been done before. And it's been fascinating to see how we've evolved the tool over that time period. We have ways to provide feedback in the tool. We have a public issues page up on GitHub. And I mean, great conversations on Twitter. And without this kind of feedback and engagement, I mean, there's no way for a tool to advance and mature. When you start to compare these things to Photoshop, I think it's very easy for people that are familiar with these tools to say, it doesn't do this or it doesn't do that. I'm going to stick with what I know. And from a design standpoint, change is okay. It's not easy, and I think it's something that you have to start to force yourself to do. When you start to work with things for 5, 10, 15, maybe even an hour, and you're not getting it, or there's things that you don't like. I mean, I would challenge you to stick with it, whatever it is, because there's a mental model shift, and unless you actually make it over that hump, you're not going to be successful. I was out in New York 2 weeks ago, and I met with a designer who. Her manager said, we need to design this responsive site. She was primarily a Photoshop Illustrator user. We need to design this responsive site. I want you to use Reflow. Go. And so she sat down with the tool, and she worked with it for about a day, and just had a terrible time. Just really struggled. Came back the next day, talked to her boss again. It's like, I can't do this. I just don't get what it's doing and why it's doing it. So, he's done a bunch more responsive projects, has a bit more knowledge in terms of how web design works, how web layout works. So they sat down and they talked through a few things. And she went back the following day and was extremely successful. But she had to change the way she was approaching the problem, have an understanding of how the tool works before she could actually be successful with the tool. And so again, it's the idea that you sit down with one of these new tools, and the fact that it's not going to solve every problem today is not bad. I wager that even the problems that it's going to solve are going to help you in the long run. I would fully admit you are going to take a hit up front in the learning curve, but after that you're going to find new ways to solve problems that you didn't know you could solve them previous. So if we talk about design, I think one of the key aspects of design is communication. You're communicating how a problem is going to be conveyed, how a solution could be done. And it's this communication aspect that I think is one of the most important and oldest aspects of design. But the way things are evolving today, layout is now part of design. I think from a design standpoint, you have to own layout. You have to know the way you structure things impacts the way this information is going to be perceived. And if you haven't done the necessary work, research, to figure out how layout is going to play into your design, how it's going to be affected across your different screens, then quite honestly, you're not doing your job as a designer. You're not supporting your engineering team the way you should be. So let's talk about Reflow. I think there's several ways that Reflow can help you do this. The idea of design and the idea of layout are central to the philosophy of Reflow. But the big question I get is who is supposed to be using Reflow and why? So I have an extremely scientific chart here. It has lines and I added a curve. And so kind of this general middle area. And to me, this bell curve represents who is being the most influential in web design today. I think there's this artificial line in the middle that kind of slides left and right. You know, it's this gradient of designers and developers that we were talking about first thing. And so when you have designers who are aware of HTML and CSS, they're going to be able to work inside of this tool, and there's going to be things that are familiar from both Photoshop and the way the web works. And if you're attacking this from a front-end development standpoint, you're going to be able to structure your page, create basic markup very quickly and see how those things are going to behave. So to me, this is the area where we're targeting. I mean, if you look over to the left of maybe let's just call it that side. You know, and your more pure visual designers. I mean, people who are doing print design today, working in Photoshop and Illustrator, and they're perfectly happy there. That's fine. They have a great tool to solve the challenges that they have. And if you're working on server-side generation of templates to render HTML pages, I'm sorry, but you know, Reflow is probably not going to help you there either. But it's this new area where I think the workflow is changing faster than we can even stay current with. And so Reflow is not a tool that generates a final page that you're going to upload to your server. Reflow is a communication tool. It allows you to convey what I call responsive intent. So as you lay things out on the screen, everything is relatively positioned. We're using percentages, so everything scales. So rather than creating these fixed elements, you can have percentage-based elements. So as the screen resizes, things shrink, things grow, things will slide down to the next row. This is responsive behavior. I want my nav to be a fixed 50 pixels from the left and not shrink as my screens shrink. You know, that's responsive behavior. And designing to content. So to me, this is about taking your actual assets, your actual copy, bringing that in, because I think content is one of the most important aspects of responsive design. You need to think about your information. What's going to be important to be perceived on a mobile device? What's going to be important to be perceived on a desktop? Ely, coffee people. They've got a really interesting thing on their site. It is a beautiful responsive site. I'd encourage you to check it out. But on the top of their site, on the desktop site, it's things like product searching and a big hero for the latest thing that they just launched and some new coffee machine. But when you load the same site up on a mobile device, up at the top of the page are things like store locator, prices for information. And so that's thinking about your content. It's what is somebody going to do on this device in this location, and how can we best serve them? To me, that's the essence of responsive design. So with Reflow, I think the most common question is, what's the workflow? Here we're introducing a new tool into a workflow that's quickly evolving. What do you do? How do you start? Where do you end? And so I think there's two great ways to start. We launched an update back in the beginning of September that introduced import from Photoshop. So you can actually take a comp that you've created inside of Photoshop. You can take layer groups or individual layers and give them a file extension like .png or .jpeg, .svg. And that will, if you add that .png to a layer group, that will take all of the layers inside of that group and combine it into a PNG file. And so Reflow can consume that and actually grab all of those assets out of Photoshop and place it on the stage. So over there on the left, you see the panel inside of Reflow where we actually have a direct live connection to Photoshop where we can start to communicate in real time. It's absolutely amazing. And so from Photoshop, you can import these assets. You can also import your content. So as you've laid out text, it's going to bring text over, but it's going to be editable HTML text. And we map it to web fonts. We take your 18-point font size inside of Photoshop and we map it to 1.2 Ms on a web-based canvas. Like, this is getting you closer to reality when designing for the web. We also bring over your layout. So now in Photoshop, we have things absolutely positioned, at an X and Y of 300 by 400. So when we bring that over into Reflow, we actually make a whole pass over all of your content and we switch it to relative static positioning. So everything is now 2.3% from the object to the left. So you get that element of scaling right off the bat. And all of this is made possible by a recent update to Photoshop that introduced generator technology. So what Generator does is it's actually an open source Node server baked onto the side of Photoshop. So if anybody wanted to write a plugin for Photoshop, you can write a Node plugin and extend this functionality. A tremendous amount of information is literally just streaming out of Photoshop, and you can catch it and do some really interesting things. Photoshop ships with an asset extraction plugin. So if you go up to File, Generate, Extract Assets, it's going to take all of those layers that you've defined with an extension and just dump them in a directory. That's really pretty awesome. So if we look at Photoshop, this is a Photoshop comp like any other, really. But if we dig in and look over there on the left, like, you can see hero.png or github.png. And even that GitHub layer, that has layer effects applied to it. It will take all of these things and combine it into a single image. Even right below that, you can see irc.png, and inside of that folder has all of the different layers that comprise the IRC logo. And it's just going to take all of those layers and give you an asset. So you can export this from Photoshop. So if you if you install Photoshop, then you install Reflow, we're actually going to install the Reflow plugin directly into Photoshop as well. So if you go up to File, Generate, it'll say Edge Reflow Project. And when you click that, it's going to create a folder, it's going to extract all the assets, and it's going to create a Reflow project for you. Or you can just have your Photoshop file up and running, open up Reflow, and click Import. And really, it's potato. I wasn't sure if that was going to come across or not. They're the same thing. except we smile more. So if we look at that PSD, this is what happened when I click import. I mean, everything came across. Now, this looks great, don't get me wrong. This is not perfect. This is not done. This is a starting point for you to create your responsive designs. And yeah, over there on the side, there's a little grabber handle. I think I have a, it's kind of coming across. No, so much for the laser. So there's a handle, and that handle you can actually resize the design surface. And that's how you start to create your responsive approaches. Now, if I were to grab that handle and just squish it a little bit, we get something that looks like that. And that's not very good. Because there's a huge thing missing here. Hierarchy. Hierarchy in the web is the most important thing. If you took everything on your web page and you basically deleted every single div and just positioned it relative to each other, and then you started to resize it, you're going to see what happened on the last page. You need to start to go through and add group things, add parents, create that structure to your page. And as soon as you start to create that structure to your page, you're going to have the resized behaviors that you want to see. So this is, again, that same Photoshop import panel inside of Reflow. Now, you'll see it says create new page. Now, say this was one page of, this is actually brackets.io. Anybody familiar with Brackets? Yeah, it's the open source text editor Adobe's been working on for a little while. It's super cool. Lots of forks, lots of contributions. I would encourage you guys to check it out. But this is their new web page. Now, say they had the second page to this site, and it existed in another comp. If I just change Photoshop to have that PSD in focus, I just have that tab open, it would say connected to brackets.io _ about. It just looks to whatever page is currently active, and it'll update immediately. And if I were to click create new page, it'll actually create a new page inside of Reflow, bring in all of those assets, so I can start to combine all of these different pages into a single project inside of Reflow. So the last piece being, at the very bottom, we have a thing called Photoshop Sync. Now, this is actually really interesting, and one of the awesome side effects we kind of found out as we were playing with Generator inside of Photoshop. So with the asset extraction workflow, inside of Photoshop, if I change a layer, I don't have to save, I don't have to re-export, I don't have to do anything. That changed grouping is just going to be re-exported to the file system. So we took that same thing here, and when you turn this on, if I make a change to any of these assets that I brought over inside of Photoshop, I'm going to get an update notification on my assets panel. And I click the refresh the asset, and that asset's going to get updated live on my design surface. So you don't have to re-import a whole Photoshop document. You don't have to re-slice out, re-save for web, re-import an individual graphic. It's just a single update, and you even get a notification when that happens. So the other aspect too is this import assets to the library. So really this, when you're connected to a PSD, I click import to library. And rather than putting everything on the screen, it's just going to drop it into your assets library, which is just kind of cut off on the edge of the screen there, 2 icons up, and that shows you all assets that are now present in your project. So then there's the other approach of actually just doing original design inside of Reflow. Actually not all that hard to do. You can do a tremendous amount using just CSS and your content and some individual images to create really beautiful sites. So here's an example of one called Adventure Co. Now you'll notice all of those little colored bars up at the top, and those represent your media queries. So as you resize your screen, wherever you start to see your design break down, and again, cut off on the edge, up there at the top is a little plus button. You hit that plus button, and it's just going to drop a media query. You drop that media query, and you can start to fix up that portion of your design. And so you're starting to override properties. And then that's essentially how responsive design is done. Now, you can take a couple of different routes to this. but we want to enable you to be successful in design. So if you look at kind of this middle area with our snorkeler, if I were to select it, you would see, well, I suppose it is selected, but there on the left, you can see the background panel. And so we're using basic CSS properties to expose the way a design would actually be created. We've taken several layers and made them a background to a div. And then even on top of that, we expose a lot of the different properties of this background image. So I have it set to cover. You know, you can use cover, you can use contain, you can set things to be 100%, you can change how things are aligned. You guys sit out in the back, there's plenty of room over here. Feel free to come on in. There's also a couple of ways that you could approach this design. I mean, this is, I think, more of a desktop first approach, where you can see our default styles are kind of over here on the left, and then we have arrows actually showing the ways in which the design is going to be progressing. The styles are going to cascade. But if you wanted to change that, if you press and hold the little plus button in the upper right, you get the Media Query Manager panel. So this allows you to toggle back and forth between using min media queries or max media queries. So if you flip this to using min media queries, now you're doing a mobile first approach. So if you use min media queries, you just shrink your design surface down to wherever you want to start for mobile and start designing there. And then incrementally make your design bigger, add the breakpoints where it makes sense, and you're designing mobile first. If you want to get in and explicitly define some pixel sizes, you can type those into the field. If you type in where it says add label, you know, you may want to actually name one of those breakpoints for a specific reason. Maybe call it iPad if it's 1024, 768. But it's a good way of, I think, visualizing some of the media queries that you have. So we look down at the bottom of the page. We have this is more like a layers panel, if you're familiar with Photoshop. But really what we're exposing here is the DOM tree. Now, as it extends along the bottom, you could think of this more as a branch of the tree. It's showing you each of the layers and its parent. So, you know, maybe I can see it on this tiny one. So we have an image selected on the far right that has a box as a parent, then the content container, then the body. Now, you can navigate, you can grab and reorder things inside of this list. You can double click and change the name, so that's going to be changing the ID on the individual element. You know, you can really start to work with things, I think, in the way that you may be familiar with working with them in Photoshop, but as well as the way it actually is reflected inside of the web. This is our asset panel. Now, I will say if you guys are familiar with Reflow at all, this version of the asset panel is coming in our next update. Now that you are importing assets from Photoshop, you're getting a lot more bitmaps. So we wanted to make it a lot easier to sort and filter. We show you use counts of the asset. We allow you to update the asset from the file system. You know, there's a lot of actions that you can take in this panel that can impact everywhere across your design. So then we get to the topic of layout. And to me, layout is one of the more interesting and the most challenging thing that we've done inside of Reflow. You know, in many ways, I think layout is kind of the secret sauce. You know, inside of Photoshop, everything is absolutely positioned. Inside of the web, there's pure web native layout. You know, but we tried to find some place in the middle that could ideally make sense to everybody. And so if we look at kind of how it works today, you know, here I've got a little video. I've got 3 boxes. I'm just going to drag this box in between those 2 boxes. And this is actually kind of confusing. And I think this is a fantastic example of something in an early product that I don't think works very well. But it's something that I want to show you. We have a new way that this is going to work that's coming out in our next update, and hopefully this will resonate a little bit better. Now this is a very simple example, but going back to that same Adventure Co example, let's say I have some elements that are stacked up here and I want to reorder them. Like, again, that is gonna be, I don't know where it's going in the DOM order. DOM order actually changed. How do I fix things up? It's outside the container. I've got some negative margins. I need a new hope. Something is going to help us. New hope. People, come on. I'm dying up here. So, we've done a few things. First, we are actually changing the UI. We have pulled back a lot of the visuals. To me, it was getting really very heavy. We wanted to show your content and get some of the overlays and some of the grids out of the way. So I'm going to do this same thing where I had those 3 boxes. Grab my box tool, draw out the 3 boxes. Now, I'll grab that same box on the left here, drag it into the middle, and you'll see now there's this insertion caret. And so now it's telling you exactly where it's going to drop, it's swapping out DOM order, and it's moving the other element out of the way. And it's also sometimes maintaining the existing margin. If I were to snap it all the way to the left, it would keep the margin that the other element had. If I dropped it in the middle, it's actually going to cut the margin in half. And here, if I snapped it to the right, it would take the margin that was there and reapply it to the element that's now in the middle. So I'll say this is much more similar to web layout, but again, trying to have some design affordances and have some more expected things happen. And if we look at this in the context of this same design again, you know, as I drag that, this works much better. And so hopefully with some of these changes, it's going to allow you to be significantly more successful as you're designing with Reflow.
And this is going to be available, this version?
So yeah, this update is coming in the next few weeks or a month. I don't have an actual date yet, but I will say we release every 6 weeks, possibly every 2 months tops. And we just released a couple weeks ago. So yeah, and I will say I literally took these videos from a special branch that I had spun up for me this morning. So this is by all means hot off the presses. So we've talked about Reflow a lot in terms of designing web pages and designing responsively, and I think that's very interesting, and there's a lot of challenges that around that. But the designer working on Reflow has taken an interesting tact as of late, and we have started to design Reflow using Reflow. And it had proven out to me much better than I thought possible. So here is our new library panel. And so the application actually needs to be rendered in both Retina and non-Retina. Turned out to be an awesome use for our breakpoints. So all new features are actually being designed inside of Reflow, and our devs are actually really digging it. They're getting all the sizing information, the coloring information, and layout information automatically, and it's really sped up development. So coming close. So after we create this design, what do you do next? We give you all the CSS for every element, and you can see that how all of those different properties evolve across the different breakpoints. You can see the properties, and you can really, I think, start to visualize how things are evolving throughout. This is our project structure. So I've opened it up in case you haven't looked at an actual Reflow project. Anytime you save the file, we generate the HTML and the CSS, as well as all the image assets are saved out externally. So all of this information is here ready for you to consume the way you see fit. And this is actually a really awesome brackets extension. Terry Ryan, who's actually speaking right now somewhere else here, check it out. It's called Reflow Cleaner. It does a lot of extraction to semantics and CSS. I would say this is absolutely where we're going, but Terry just got there first. And all that being said, we are extremely young. We're making a lot of progress very quickly. So I want to show you a few more things that are becoming in our next update. So one of the huge requests has been HTML elements. So you may notice we have a new tool icon up there at the top. So if you click and hold that, you start to get different HTML elements that you can use during design, inputs, form elements, buttons, lists. If you have some buttons, you can link between pages or load arbitrary URLs. Control things like states. Look for, you can create custom states to things. So try it. I think not only try Reflow, there's a lot of emerging tools in this space. I think you should try them all. And again, if you aren't providing feedback on these tools, they quite literally will never get better and never actually solve the challenges that you have. So that is going to be my word of advice for today. Thanks a lot, guys. You can get some more information here. Follow us on Twitter.